who had had the chance of being taught did the same. It was possible for any man of brains to rise from the bottom to the top. Inventions were made which enabled all kinds of new work to be done and new wealth produced. The North was rich in material, richer in the men she had to work it, who were helped and encouraged by the freedom which threw every career open to real talent. In the South, all power was in the hands of the aristocratic families, who had had it always. The work was done by slaves. Owners did not want to educate their slaves, for then they were afraid that they would want their freedom. The coal mines of the South were not discovered. They could not have been worked by slaves. The South began to be very jealous of the North, and the North began to disapprove of the South. More and more people began to see that slavery was wrong. People were not yet ready to say that slavery ought to cease to be, but they were ready to say that it must not be extended. At the time of the Mexican War the South had shown that it wanted to extend slavery. This frightened the North. In 1850 an agreement was made, known as the Missouri Compromise. By this a line, 36° 30', called Mason and Dixon's line, was drawn across the map of America. North of this line, slavery was never to exist. Speakers on both sides declared that the Missouri Compromise was as fixed as the Constitution itself. Stephen Arnold Douglas was the loudest in expressing this opinion. "It is eternal and fundamental," he declared. Douglas was a traitor of the great party known as the Democrats. He held that the people of every State had a right to decide questions affecting that State, and not the central American government. Douglas had one great aim, which was to him far more important than any question of political right or wrong. He wanted to be made President. To secure this, he saw that he must get the support of the South. To win the support of the South he took a most dangerous and important step, one which was the immediate cause of the war which broke out 6 years later. He declared that the people of any State or territory could decide whether or not they would have slavery in their State. They could establish it or prohibit it. He went further than this. 2 new territories had been organized in the Northwest, Nebraska and Kansas. They claimed to be admitted to the Union as States. Both States were, of course, north of Mason and Dixon's line, and therefore, by the Missouri Compromise, they must be free States. But the South was bent on creating new slave States as fast as the North could create free States. They wanted to make Kansas a slave State. Stephen Douglas therefore introduced in 1854 the famous Kansas-Nebraska Bill. It declared that Kansas might be slaveholding or free, as the people of the territory should decide. The result of this bill was for the first time to unite together a strong party in the North in opposition to the Democrats, who were allied to the South. This new party called itself Republican. Lincoln was a spokesman of their views. They declared, firstly, that Congress, which is the Parliament representing all the States which together formed the Union, has the right to decide whether slavery shall be lawful in any particular State or not, and not the people of that State alone. Secondly, they declared that, in the case of Kansas, Congress had already, 4 years ago, decided that Kansas could not have slavery, because it lay beyond the line, north of which slavery could not exist. Resolutions were passed in many of the Northern State parliaments against the Kansas-Nebraska bill. The Parliament of Illinois sent one. Now it was quite clear to keen-sighted politicians that, while Douglas and his party pretended that they wanted to give the people of Kansas the choice between owning slaves and not doing so, what they really wanted was to force Kansas to have slaves. Those who supported the Missouri Compromise declared that it was illegal to give Kansas the choice however she used it. Events soon proved that Kansas was not to have any choice at all. Kansas had few inhabitants, but the opinion of the people of the state was against slavery. Next door to Kansas, however, on the east, was the slave-holding state of Missouri. From Missouri, bands of armed men came into Kansas in order to vote for slavery at the election, and to prevent the real voters from using their votes against it. Free fighting went on in the state. An election was held at which armed men kept away those who would have voted for freedom, and a pro-slavery man was chosen. But few of the people of Kansas had been allowed to vote. The free party met at another place afterwards, and a genuine popular vote elected an anti-slavery man. Civil war went on in Kansas for 2 years. Now, the importance of these events is this. Up till now most people in the North had believed that slavery ought to be left alone, because it would gradually die out. The Kansas-Nebraska bill and the Kansas election made it perfectly clear that the South was not going to let slavery die out. On the contrary, they wanted to spread it to strengthen themselves against the North. Douglas was a member for Chicago in the north of Illinois. He came down to Illinois to win the state to his views, and made a series of speeches there. This at once called Lincoln to the fore. He saw more clearly, perhaps, than any man in America what the Kansas bill meant. It meant that either North and South must separate, as the abolitionists, that is, the party which held that slavery ought to cease to be, and some people in the South hoped, or that the North would have to force the South to abandon the attempt to spread slavery. He made a series of great speeches in Illinois in which he made it quite clear that Douglas and his followers, and the men of the South, might say that they wanted to leave states free to have slavery or not as they chose, but what they really desired was to force them to have slavery whether they chose or not. Quote, "This declared indifference, but, as I must think, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I say that no man is good enough to govern another man without that man's consent. Slavery is founded upon the selfishness of man's nature, opposition to it on his love of justice." End of chapter 4. Recording by John Leader, Bloomington, Illinois.